Could I get someone to close? Vance, could you close the door? Yeah, thanks. Well, we watched the people of Israel partake of their first Passover, and the great lesson that they learned, I suspect there's no guarantee that they did, but what's the lesson that you got from that Passover and the power that was in the blood, which was mentioned earlier this morning?
The importance of obedience.
Okay, they were told that God is going to do something very terrible to the people of Egypt, the firstborns. And they would be protected if they did what? Right? What are you going to say, Lupe? Yeah, the top and down the sides. And that way, when God passed through there, then he would overlook their frailties, if you will. But the main thing was that the Egyptians would not do that, and then they would suffer as a result of that. And then Israel would be saved by the blood. And of course, that's one of those things that Dave Stitt was talking about as far as the thread is concerned. We've got a couple of them, in Genesis chapter 2, the prophecy dealing with the defeat of Satan, the damaging of Satan. And then, of course, we get the promise to Abraham, leading us to a time when, after a while, there would be people who were his descendants, and they would be going into captivity, and then they would be let out. And so that's where we are right now. In chapter 13, at the end of chapter 13, we get, I guess, an understanding of what it was like after the events of the Passover. Now, I want you to try to think about this. Here they were, without telling you what I think the answer is, but what general condition do you think, mentality, that these people were in when all of a sudden it was time to go? Now, we've had some guesses about how many people there were, and it's probably, depending on whether you're counting men and women, but I mean, we're talking about 600,000 to 800,000. So it was. Go ahead. Sorry, Luke. Yeah, they were, but I guess there'd be a certain malaise, of what's going on. I mean, I can only imagine what it must be like. We find out about them getting a little bit more organized when they're told to march in array. But I've often wondered about that. Okay, it's time to go, because they were told it's going to happen and you are to be prepared for it to happen. And so I've often thought about that. What was it like when all of a sudden they were headed out the door, so to speak, and they were leaving? Well, in chapter 13, we get an insight that God has into the people, beginning in verse 17. It says, now it came about that when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. I would say closer, and that might help us to understand it a little bit better. All right. I know I have a remote control, but it's not that important because I only have one slide. So we'll just pop it up here. I thought it'd be good to be reminded of where it was they were living all those years, and where they were going to be going. Now, if you look up there near Goshen, let's just say that's the general area that they were existing in for those number of generations. Now, if they were going to go to where the Philistines generally lived, and probably were more used to seeing maps of the Philistines as being a part of a map, certainly during the time of David and Solomon, because they were the thorns in the soles of the feet of, if you will, of Israel at this time, and they made life really difficult for them. So if they went straight across, so you can see now going back over to, let's just see where it says Amalek, and you see Canaan, the best way to go would be to go how? And so why would you go up the coast, David? Okay, so you could go, and they were inland as well, but if they went generally up that direction, that would probably be the best way to go. That would be the most direct way to go. All right? Okay, so what's going to happen is that God, understanding these people quite well, tells them, I don't want you to go that way. And here's the reason why. Question 2 says, how did God expect Pharaoh to react to Israel traveling in a way to avoid the Philistines? In other words, he wants them to not go straight across and deal with the Philistines. He wants them in the end to travel to the south. And he explains why. And why is that? It's that. Yeah, if people would change their minds when they see war, and then they would want to return to Egypt. Go ahead, Karen.
Another factor is they had lived in Goshen, which is a fairly lush area because it's in the Delta. They
Sure.
lived there for 4 centuries. And their entire population, that was their homeland. That's the only homeland they had ever known. So,
Right.
like you said, when they take those first steps, if they run into any kind of adversity, they're just going to turn around and go back.
Right, things are going to, I mean, you can imagine, let's go back to my point about all these people. And there they are, and the first thing they have to do is fight the Philistines. That would be something that could be, for the way they looked at things. Now, we understand that they should have believed God could do what? God was going to take care of them. But we realize that as time goes along in this trip, this 40 years, that they're very, very mistrusting of God at times. And we're going to find out when we look at what actually happened there. It helps us to understand that God certainly, obviously, God knows everything, so he has great insight into what's going to happen. And so in chapter 14, let's see, well, maybe we need to go back up. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. In verse 18, it says, hence God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea. And of course, the Red Sea is, you can see the Gulf there of Suez, and of course, the water heads back up on toward the Mediterranean Sea, and they crossed in there somewhere. There's a lot of debate about where they crossed, and that's not the important thing. It's certainly not at this point. But anyway, so in verse 19, we find out about something that seems a little bit, off the mark in terms of, what's actually going on. So verse 19, could someone read that for me of chapter 13?
Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. It said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place.
Okay, now, they've had these bones for a while. I mean, remember, it was 400 years before when Joseph was a great leader amongst Egypt. And then why did things go badly for Israel? Because Joseph was dead and, excuse me, not dead yet, but a Pharaoh comes along who doesn't know who Joseph is. And so things begin to go downhill from that particular point in time. All right, now, so it says that you should get those bones, and they, as I said, they've been keeping them for quite a while. And I ask you the question, from where did Joseph find where Joseph was promised what we read in chapter 13 and verse 19. Anyone check that out?
Chapter 50, verses 24 and 25.
Okay, read it nice and loud, Carol.
And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here.
Okay, so what does this show about Joseph that we've kind of known all along if we've studied from chapter 35 on? What does this show about Joseph? What's that, Vic? His faith in God. I mean, he saw God interacting in his life all the time. And so he really wanted to be back in the land of Canaan. Now, why would that be the case? Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Well, if you think about it, he was taken to Egypt against his will when he was a youth. And at his dying breath, he wanted to be buried in the land where his father was buried. His father was also buried back in
Right.
Canaan. He wanted to be buried exactly where he knew where he belonged. He took the sense of something he wanted.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Even though he'd spent those many, many years there as a very significant person in Egypt, he always, I think, rightly thought, my place to be ultimately is to be back in the land of Canaan, because that's my land. And so he never really shook the idea of, now I'm a big cat Egyptian. He seemed to not really be all that enamored with that as he's coming to the end of his life. And so he wants his bones to be taken back over there. And so again, to just be reminded, you might wonder, what did they do with these things and how did they keep them? And they managed to do it. It's probably not that important, but nevertheless they did. And so they just wanted to make at this point that, okay, before we really get going, let's remember we have what? The bones of Joseph. And I guess, in some ways, for me, again, as I try to inject my reactions to things that might have been going on there, is that I'm thinking, we've got enough on our minds here, Can't we just leave it here and just be done with it? Well, because he trusted God, and he always understood that whatever would happen, God was going to take care of him. In this particular case, to get his bones back over, he knew God would see that would happen. And so he believed in it, and that's exactly what they did, as far as we know. So they took the bones, and it says Joseph died at the age of 110 years. This is over in Genesis. And he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So I guess we could assume that he's still there. Go ahead, Larry.
In a bigger picture that they couldn't have understood until later, an enslaved people who couldn't be free, God freed them. God led them. God protected them. But also God kept his promise for those that had died before, that he will bring them also. I could see that being comfort for first century Christians who were saying, what about people who died?
Right.
Well, God has the power to bring in his, it may have been Moses that did it, but it was God's plan
Yeah.
that Joseph would be moved out.
Yeah.
Even the dead are protected. Nothing can be saved. Nothing can be overcome by sin and death.
Yeah, and I think you're right to make that connection with the Thessalonians, to what about going to happen to those people who've died, and then God's going to take care of that. Good point. Okay, so in question 4, I say, find where Joseph was promised. We did that. And then how did God lead Israel on this journey? Now, this is kind of important, and I think when you think about this as you learned about it, when you were growing up, if you happened to be in a Sunday school or Bible classes, you would have probably learned this. But how did he manage to lead them? And it's obviously, we've had just a major amount of miracles. And the whole thing just continues to be miraculous. And I think that's the thing that's very powerful to me. And again, my conclusion, again, and this is probably typical of the way we look at the people of Israel, with all this stuff happening, what would we expect of them? With all these miracles and everything. Go ahead, Jackie. Yeah, there'd be no question. That's what we'd kind of think. I've seen all these things. The plagues, terrible, but it also tells us about at the end of that period that Moses and Aaron were also doing amazing miracles. And now they've got something else very miraculous that's going to be used to lead them. And so I think our natural reaction, even though those of us who study this enough times, know that that's not the way the story ends. That's not, even though it's normal and one would expect it, that's not what happens. Now, how does that connect to me and you? How can we make application to that? Because I think it's very easy for us to say, and it's been said many times here by me and others, well, if I would have been there, I would have had things on the right track. So that makes us even more responsible, right? Right.
So we should be more in awe and more obedient.
Yeah, one would think. I mean, I'm a little bit conflicted with what you guys are saying. You guys are really being a little bit too insightful, I think. Okay. And that is, I'm thinking of this in a kind of fleshly sort of way. And that is, wow, look at all this stuff. What power that God is demonstrating. And what you guys you're saying, okay, we got the big picture, we understand it, we know what the message is, and then we believe that ought to cause us to do what, or to be what? Go, you can follow that along if you want, Vance. Yeah, I mean, that's what it seems like. That seems like how it ought to work. That's how it seemed like it ought to work with the people of Israel. But what happens with us? Sure. Yeah, and it's one thing to have this insight. It's another thing to use it on a day-to-day basis, isn't it? I mean, we know what's good, and we know what's right, but still, we don't do what we should. Go ahead, Cindy. Cindy, go ahead. Okay.
People in general don't really change all that well, and we all feel it's a difference. This was huge change. So you've got 600,000 guys and their families.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to reach just 200 people here.
Sure.
To make a few changes. You're dealing with a lot of personalities.
Sure.
So it'd be nice for everybody to just all thought the same and reacted the same.
Yeah. And so I think we're aware. This is what makes God's grace so much more meaningful, because He knows what Israel was like, and He still did everything He could to take care of them. He knows what you're like. He knows what I am like, and so He's out there, trying to make sure. Randy, do you know that I'm always giving you the opportunity to escape sin? Do you believe that? Do you care about it enough to actually respond to it that way? And so again, what we see here is, what kind of people are these? And God knew these people. And I think, going back to Cindy's point about change, one could see how that would have been a major jolt to them, what's happening. And I think God knows that that's going to be the case, so that's why, and I guess I'm just inferring, but that's why He said, look, I'm just not going to put these people through all this at the beginning, because He knows what they're like. And He knows what we're all like. And again, it gives me greater faith, I guess, in God, when, again, yes, I'm disappointed with the Israelites, just like I get disappointed with me. But He's still there. He's still there. And that's such a beautiful thing. So, how did He lead them? Look down there in verse 21 and 22. Richard, could you read that, please?
The Lord, 13,
No, chapter 13, yeah.
the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way. Cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people.
Okay, so could this be a confidence builder? I mean, it could if you had any concept of what was actually going on. Maybe you could. I mean, I'm hoping that it was explained to them. But that's what this is all about. And so here they are. They're going to be taken care of. They're not just going to be 600,000 plus people aimlessly wandering around. God has provided something that I don't recall ever reading about in any other place in Scripture, but where God provided such guidance for these people. And of course, once they got the hang of it, they understood what it was all about. How would they respond to that? I mean, just try to put yourself there. You're wandering around out there in your robes and your sandals. Well, they end up complaining, don't they? Which is, again, a little bit surprising, at the same time understood. Because I think Cindy's point, about this was a rather powerful change. I mean, I'm sure it's like a lot of us. When you think you're going to have a whole lot of freedom, you get all excited about it. You go, oh, wow, I've got this freedom. And then all of a sudden, you're living it, and boy, it's not exactly what I thought it was going to be. And so, I mean, they had just a major case of this all the time. And that's what happens when we get down into chapter 14. And we'll notice that as we pursue our way down through that. But let's look at chapter 14. He says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before, and it mentions all the places that they're going to be camping, in the sea, and you shall camp in front of Baal Zephon, opposite it by the sea. So that's where they are. And going back to Dave's point, it seems like their movement toward the sea was what they were about to do, or they were certainly going in that direction. So it said, for Pharaoh, this is God explaining to Moses to be able to explain to the people. For Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. So once they get out there and they're wandering around, then the reaction to a guy who's very inclined to change his mind, remember, I'll let you go, and then he says, no, I'm not going to let you go. All right, so they get out there, and there they are. They're wandering around aimlessly. They're looking pretty much like ducks in a pond, really, as far as being able to control this thing. And so that's exactly what he's going to do. It says they're wandering aimlessly. Then verse 4, it says, thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them. Of course, again, this was always a part of the process that God, all he had to do was alter circumstances a little bit in order to harden this guy's heart. Remember, we pointed out that this is not something where he was powerless over it. It just simply that God knew how to push his buttons, I suspect, would be maybe a way of kind of crude way of looking at it. But nevertheless, he knows how he's going to react to things. And probably some of you, those of you who have had children, you understand that one of the things about your children is most of the time they're pretty predictable. And of course they fool you when you think you've got it all figured out. I remember that. But at the same time, for the most part, you kind of know what they're going to do. And God knew what Israel was going to do, and God knew what Pharaoh was going to do. And so here they are in that scene, and it says, so when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servant had a change of heart toward the people and said, well, what is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? This almost sounds like he's a little sociopathic. I mean, He just can't figure out, his realities. I mean, he's so wrapped up in himself that that's all he really thinks about. And all of a sudden, this is hurting him. And so we can't have this. And we're not shocked, because it's not the first time he's done something like this. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, how long is it from the time he says this back to when all the firstborn in Egypt died?
Well, it's days. Let's put it that way. It's not a long time. I mean, I can't tell you the exact amount of days. So
That's just amazing to me.
yeah,
What's wrong with this guy?
yeah. Well, I mean, he pulled it every time at the stage of every plague that was placed before him.
But doesn't it make sense that people of Egypt are really mad at him? They know it's, or maybe they don't know it's because of him.
Yeah, and maybe it's just because of his power.
Children are dying, all the firstborns are dying, then, I mean,
Yeah, I see what you're saying is that, okay, if they learned, something, then maybe the people would go, what are you going to do? Do you see what happened because you would not allow them to go? But of course, power is power, and the people probably didn't have much say in that regard, although they could have rebelled against it in some sort of revolt. Yes, Cindy? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, and I think that was one of his most impressive, if you will, weaknesses, was that. Yeah. And so he's just looking at this as, oh no, what did I do? And there may have been some people who were around him going, what's going on here? Don't you understand the pattern that we've been in here? Okay, so he says, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart. In verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, he says he had a change of heart toward the people. And he says, what is this we have done? And then in verse 6, it says, so he made his chariot ready and took his people with him. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. So a goodly part, I guess, of the army. I mean, all may mean all in this particular case, but nevertheless, he is determined to do what, according to the way I worded the question in question 2 of that second part. Yeah, what did Pharaoh determine to do? He was going to chase them down. Okay, so if you look now at his force, if you will, I guess it looks pretty good. I mean, he's prepared for a victory here. I mean, I think that's what he thinks. I mean, he's really amassed quite a force to go after them. And it says in verse 8 that the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. So, we're starting out, how now, Israel? I'll get you, Larry, in a second. How are we starting out, Israel? Boldly. So they're feeling their oats right, at this point in time, aren't they? Yeah, Larry. Yeah.
They leave in an organized way. They leave as an army.
Uh-huh.
But then, I don't know if it's significant or not, but in the next chapter, God says that Pharaoh's going to notice now they're moving aimlessly.
Yeah.
They've broken, their cohesion is falling apart.
Yeah.
They look like they're rising. Whereas before, that was an army moving. Now it's just a bunch of people.
Yeah, and I think, if you've ever gone on a long hike and you've got a number of people in it, kind of start out how we're all together and we're just pumping right along, and then what happens? Then we get stragglers, yeah. And everybody's spread all over the hill, all over the mountain, so to speak. And like Larry's saying, I think that would have evolved. And again, the organization of them, marshaled array, I mean, I think it certainly carries with it the idea of organized as they moved. But I think that also might have been just to keep track of the people. I mean, we got to keep everyone together the best we can. And then, of course, we're maybe going to look a little bit more confident if we're together. I mean, that's why, when you're in the military, they teach you how to march, I mean, because, when you look at a bunch of people marching and they're all marching together, it's kind of impressive. And so, yeah, it can be. All right, so how did they react when they saw this army of people coming? Okay, verse 10 through 12. Daniel Stitt, would you read that for us?
When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness."
So what are you thinking about that? Yeah, what's that?
They're a little dramatic.
Well, yeah.
It sounds like a teenager, like, oh my gosh, what have you done to us? Now we're going to die out here. There's no
Yeah.
graves. We're just going to, we're just going to keep dead up on the ground.
Yeah, and this is not a theme that is totally unusual for these people. That when they say, "What's going on here? Did you get us out here to when they ran out of water? Did you just bring us out here to die?" I mean, again, there we go thinking, man, how can you guys be so forgetful about the things that have happened? And, God didn't put you out here to have you all killed. I mean, again, there must have been some people thinking that way. But anyway, when I asked the question, how did the sons of Israel react when they saw the army coming? And then I ask you then to say, well, then, with what words, or to answer, with what words does Moses exhort the people? So here they are, they're in a state of fear, going back to Christina saying they were being very dramatic, and not showing much confidence in God. But again, understand, we got all these people, we're all together, and then all of a sudden here comes this army, and they don't have any chariots. Now we do know they came away with a lot of trinkets and things like that. They did have that. And a certain amount of wealth they were able to take out, but they certainly weren't prepared to fight these guys. At least I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw. All right, now, so what does Moses say then? Verse 13. Go ahead, Daniel.
Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again."
Forever, he says. So, I mean, is this like the coach taking people into the locker and really giving them a real pep talk? I mean, it's what it kind of sounds like. We're going to beat these guys. Not we, but God's going to do it for us. Somebody have a hand up over here? Okay. All right, now, so all he says, I mean, what's the answer? He doesn't say, think this through. He just says what? Yeah, don't fear. Do not fear. And we can understand, I think, why there were a lot of them who were afraid. I mean, because they're getting blocked. The closer they get to the sea, they have nowhere to go. What are we going to do? So it's understandable. However, they should have been thinking what? About reminding themselves of what happened when they were in Egypt, when Moses was sent. And of course, were they a little negative with Moses sometimes, by the way? Going back to what's said here? Yeah, when he killed someone, their reaction was, well, what are you going to do? You're going to kill us? Not really thinking about the fact that he, defeated some Egyptian. So, they had a tendency to be that way. So, in question number 5 in section 2, I say, explain the role of the people, Moses and God, as the crossing of the water began. So I want you to think about this as we read 15 through 17. Travis, would you read that, please? 15 through 17 of chapter 14.
"The Lord said to Moses, crying out, Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, let
Okay. What's the role of the people? I was very specific about that. I want to know the role of the people, the role of Moses, and the role of God. Yeah, go forward. In other words, don't be discouraged. Keep moving. That's, in essence, that's all they got to do. I mean, it seems pretty unbelievable that, okay, that's all they're so much on our tail here, and all we got to do is just go forward. And so, but then Moses gets involved, and what's Moses' role? Yeah, it says that stretch out your hand, verse 16, over the sea and divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. So he is going to again be, sometimes God did things directly, but sometimes he did them through Moses. In this particular case, it's going to be through Moses. So in his place, that's what he's going to be doing. But he says, as for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will do what? That's what they're going to follow. They're going to chase them. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're going to go skipping through what they're doing, saying, oh, boy, that God's really great? So how is he being honored by them? Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
That story, that's a significant event. It's not just going to stay there. That word's going to travel around.
Right.
This is what happened when the Egyptians came after Israel.
Sure.
And not just that story, but other stories followed the Israelites when they got to the land.
Sure.
It's well known that the God of Israel is not one of the tribes.
Yeah, and to remember also that that's also what they were supposed to teach their children. All these stories remind them of what happened, and they'll hopefully believe that we can count on God. Okay, now question 6. Well, it says, what did God expect the Egyptian army to learn from this event? That God is powerful, right? All right, now, all the Egyptians will know that I am Lord. It says there in verse 18. Okay, now, in question 7, we say, explain the role of the angel of God and the pillars of the cloud, or pillar of the cloud. Now, the angel of the Lord is a figure that's not really completely explained to us. There are angels that got very directly involved, say, in the life of Abram or Abraham. But this is an angel that seems to be involved oftentimes when the power of God is to be demonstrated. And most of the time, there seems to be some sort of physical manifestation of this angel. And so when you go ahead and you follow along in the story, it says that the angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. So they're being led now. I want you to try to put this together. They've been led by the pillar, right? Pillar of fire at night, the pillar of the cloud of day. But who do we also know is involved in this now? The angel of God. And called by different names. But all the time presented to us as some sort of direct representation of God. And that may be something that can be explained in a different way. I don't know that I've ever been able to easily do that, because it's something that's obviously singled out. Now, some people have thought that this angel of God is whom? Jesus. And there's some theological reasons why maybe that shouldn't be so. And I'm not going to get into that. All I am saying is that if you want to think that about who this is, think it through, and it's just about as good a guess as any. However, what we're talking about here is what? Well, whether we understand it completely or not, what do we know about what the angel of God is doing? He's guiding the people. He's a part of the pillars. Somehow he's involved in that. And it says he'd been going before the camp of Egypt, or a camp of Israel. And, of course, we're led to believe at that point in time that it's the pillar that's leading them. But no, we find out there's something a little bit more that's going on. So, there was a cloud with darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus, the one did not come near the other all night. So, what actually happened here? What's described in verse 19 to 20? We know the angel of God being involved in it, but what actually happened? Did you go your hand up, Rick? Go ahead.
Cloud of fire moved from in front of the camp to behind the camp and out between Israel and the Egyptians.
Right.
So that they wouldn't advance on that until they were ready to.
Yeah, it was supplying some sort of protection of the people in the rear guard, if you will. And so, here's this amazing event here. And eventually what happens? I say, what made it possible for them to cross the water? Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, verse 21. And the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. And the sons of Israel went through the midst on the sea, on the dry land, of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Now, if you watch some of these shows where they're either trying to explain biblical things from a physical standpoint, there's some very interesting things about how this could have happened. You know, there could have been a wind, a natural, really, really, really powerful wind that caused this to happen. Let's just say maybe a wind had something to do with it. Does the text say that? No. But so what they don't want to do is they want to understand this thing from a strictly physical point of view, materialistic view. Now, the thing is, it's not hard for us because, we're reading this and we believe in the power of God. And so I don't have to get some sort of explanation of it, that's scientifically sound. I just accept that God did it. And I think that that's what he wants Israel to be able to do. So, in verse 26, it says again, stretch out your hand. So Moses did stretch out his hand, and the waters returned and covered the chariots. And so those that were chasing them were no longer a threat to them. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. That would have been quite an experience. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Okay, so what kind of reaction does that get out of Israel? What would one expect? Yeah, and so it says in verse 31, when Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Now, again, we get to this point, if we don't know the story as it develops, and we go, yeah, they're finally on the team. But that's just not the way it happens, does it? Just like, there are times in your life and a time in my life when, I'm really on God's team. And I'm sure I'm going to be on God's team forever. But next thing you know, I'm on the bench. And I'm not being the kind of person that I have every right to be a person of strong and powerful faith, just like Israel had every right to be that kind of people, and they had every reason to be that way, aside from just calling it right. So we learn a lot from Israel. In this stage, we're looking at this wandering period at the beginning, and we're going to see things begin to happen similar to this, where they're constantly going to be challenged. And they don't do very well very often. So that's all the time we have. I appreciate you guys and your involvement and your patience with me as per usual. Appreciate it very much. And the handouts for next week will be there Wednesday, Lord willing. So let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we know we allow ourselves to be deceived by all the things around us. And you want us to know that that is the lie and that you are the truth. And we have to realize that it's going to be challenged. Jesus said, believing in me and obeying me is not going to be an easy thing for you to do. So that's the challenge. But help us to learn from these stories. And help us to try to place ourselves into these situations where we know that this is where I can do it. You know, I'm ready. I'm ready to step into the sea and watch the seas hold up. I'm ready for that in my life in its own way. And all you ask of me is to march forward. Help us all to keep on marching. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, guys, thank you.